Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming and a new Diablo build. Today we jump back in to take a look at the insane potential of constant bone storms, thanks to the very fun unique that is these boots, Flicker Step. Per enemy we dash through, we reduce the cooldown of our ultimate by 4 seconds. Dash through a pack of enemies and you are going to reset your cooldown super quick. If we combine that with the spreading bone storms that comes from the unique Lidless wall, we can send out bone storms everywhere throughout a fight. And then that's combined with a bone golem that acts as another bone storm source. Finally, of course, there's other potent uniques that make the damage silly, leading to all of these different bone storms. This build is essentially a storm of bone storms, spreading damage over time everywhere, while becoming tanky through the shields that provides, and the golem itself. So it's a tier 100 Nightmare Dungeon clearing machine, far from just a meme. But first, a quick reminder to you guys. We've been sponsored by the awesome app Mobilytics to bring you written versions of our builds. You can find them linked in the description of all our build videos, linking you straight to a detailed showcase of the build you see today and the rest. There's all the info from the aspects to run, to class specific stuff, the new Vampiric Powers, the Paragon, the skill tree and more, all with short explanations of what and why to refer to. The in-game app also features an overlay, letting you press Tab plus Q and you'll bring up everything on the side there to refer to super conveniently. They've even got event timers to track what's going on next and when, and more features in the app like tier lists and build planners. The app is completely free to download and try, just click the link in the description and get started with it. But back to today's Storm of Bone Storms build. With this setup you can see how I fly through tier 100 pushes. Every time we dash through a pack of enemies, we're greatly reducing the cooldown of Bone Storm. There's constant points where Bone Storm is active, right? And yet my Bone Storm is ready to be used again. Through this we are spreading shadow damage over time though, as the basis of the damage, building up damage over time and proccing X-Files in AoE. The sheer amount of Bone Storms means our barrier generated by the shielding storm aspect is so strong that we become very tanky, and it barely matters because we're also often in Blood Mist anyway. With that new Sacrilegious ring, we're auto popping corpses and tendril pulling in packs, all while immune to damage. And as you can see, I'm popping these packs of mobs, the elites, and whatever else in tier 100 level content. So specifically for mob clear in tier 100s, I think this is awesome. But I will say there's some clear issues for me when I compare it directly to the true Infamous builds, where they focus on corpse explosion more than bone storm, so your single target suffers by comparison, even though your mob clear is better. We have more burst, but maybe less DPS over time. And that's why the build works so well when there's lots of mobs to debuff at once, jump through and reset the cooldowns. But it suffers more when there's only one target and we're only able to reset Bone Storm 4 seconds at a time. Though that still works, and it does mean we're Bone Storming most of the time all the same. On top of that, we're constantly proccing stuns and staggers and making ourselves very tanky thanks to Shielded Storm. The build's a lot of fun and a very unique playstyle for Necromancer, so let's talk about how this works. We'll begin with the skill tree, which we're going to blast through. We have our basic of 1 point and 2nd point in any of this because we're not actually using a basic, just to get to the next tier, but we have 3 out of 3 in Hued Flesh. I've had to put 1 point in something else, which I've just got in Bone Spear, to reach the next tier, which has us get 5 out of 5 in Blood Mist. Leveling it decreases the cooldown, which is very important, and we enhance it and go for Ghastly, so it's a guaranteed way to generate our corpses. Speaking of corpses, we full 5 out of 5 Corpse Explosion and level it further, as you can see, enhancing it and going to Blighted so that it becomes a darkness skill, dealing damage over time and triggering Shadowblight, of course. It is one of our main damage sources, so we lever it like that. 1 point into Grim Harvest to get to Fueled by Death, so as we pop those corpses, we get a big damage buff. On the next tree, of course, we take Decrepify, enhance it to Abhorrent, so it's now cooldown resetting, and as it's a curse, we take Amplify damage, so those affected by Decrepify take even more damage. We take 3 out of 3 in Death's Embrace, deal more damage to close enemies and make them do less to us, and we come down to our passives tree, where we pick up 1 point into Corpse Tendrils, and get a lot of item contribution, as you can see, enhancing it and going for Plagued, so that the enemies pulled in by the tendrils are made vulnerable. Then we have our passives, where I've got 2 points into Reaper's Pursuit. I had a leftover point, so we just put a 2nd one there, giving us movement speed through darkness skills, maxing out Gloom for the big shadow damage increase, and Terror for the same thing against CC targets. You could consider taking 1 point out of Crippling Darkness, which means your darkness skills have a chance to stun, to 3 out of 3 the movement speed if you're going for that, but it is nice to have that build up of stagger just by dealing damage against a boss. On the ultimate tree, of course, we're taking the full rack of Bone Storm, and we're going to be taking Bone both Standalone and Memento Mori in their full. Memento Mori works off of Skeleton Warriors and Mages, and since we're not using those, this is still great. And Standalone is an 18% damage reduction when you have no minions. Each active minion reduces the bonus by 2%, so with just the Golem, it's still a 16% damage reduction, which is great. For the Golem, we take 3 out of 3 in Golem Mastery, just to greatly increase its life and damage. And finally, for the key passive, of course, it's Shadowblight. For the Book of the Dead, we have the Skeletal Warriors. We're dealing mainly shadow damage, so of course we're sacrificing the Reapers for shadow damage increase. On the Mages, it's Cold to improve the damage we deal against vulnerable enemies. And then with the Golem, I'm using Bone with the upgrade 1. So each time the Bone Golem takes 20% of its max life, it sheds a corpse. That's a lot of corpses for Corpse Explosion DPS. Next up, we have our Vampire Powers. We're going to be spreading our Vampiric Curse through a Cursed Touch, instead of, say, Metamorphosis. As we deal damage to enemies, they might be afflicted by it, and then they'll spread it to other enemies, meaning we'll deal way more damage to them, especially when we're running the combo of Prey on the Weak, which turns cursed enemies into vulnerable, and we deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Running meta would be nice, so as we dash, we also use Flicker Step to reduce our Bone Storm cooldown, but it's a lot more dangerous and less consistent, especially in AoE, so I prefer a Cursed Touch for that reason, but you could run meta here instead if you wanted to. Of course, we're also running Flowing Veins, which greatly improves the damage over time effects to those affected by a Vampiric Curse or enemies that aren't moving. We also use Domination, as we are constantly triggering Corpse Tendrils and stunning enemies, so we do way more damage to them, and Anticipation to greatly reduce the cooldown of our ultimate skills. Just standing here, you can see how my Bone Storm is under a 40-second cooldown to begin with. And Bone Storm will deal 12% times more damage for each nearby enemy affected by damage over time. So that actually skyrockets Bone Storm's damage potential. Next up then, we have the Paragon board, where we have 5 boards total. As you can see, I'm just hovering over them so you can pause and check the points where they're spent if you want to. But let's explain everything from the start. We come around to Prime, going up to the Glyph, which is of course Scourge. You and your minions deal more damage to those affected by shadow damage over time. So on the start board, we can get 70 increased intelligence, a great place for this. This is how I achieve that, and I also come down to get some extra resilience for resistance to all elements. Then we exit the board and come to our first board extension, which is of course Wither. Wither greatly improves the damage of your shadow damage over time and scales based on how much intelligence you have, and that's our main stat. I rotate the board like so we can easily move to the left for the next board extension, but to start with we come around to the bottom and go through to Gnawing Darkness, where I pick up some magic nodes around it, but save a point on the damage to Elite's magic node. Then we come to the left to the Glyph, which is of course Control. We are constantly slowing and stunning enemies, and this greatly improves our damage to those targets. Also picking up magic nodes for the shadow damage increase, since that's so potent. We then work our way up, coming to the Lingering Shadow node and the magic nodes around that, working our way up and to the right to Dragging Shadows and most of the nodes around that, then coming to the right and picking up Wither, of course, to get that bonus. Then it's back towards the Glyph, where we come to the left to get to our next board, which is where we start talking Golem. This is the Hulking Monstrosity board. To begin with, we'll come to the left and go up, heading straight to the Legendary node. This improves the Golem's max life and also increases its damage. Really, we want the Golem alive as long as possible, just to be a Bone Storm stick, but also generate lots of corpses for us, as it loses 20% health over time. As we head up and around, we will come down to the Glyph socket, where we have, of course, Darkness. Those affected by shadow damage over time get reduced damage, up to 10% for 5 seconds at a time. By leveling intelligence around this Glyph, you also improve your shadow damage, so it's well worth it. So I achieve that like so. Then we come up as we work our way to the next board, where I pick up Borrowed Strength and the nodes around it. This actually gives you increased damage while the Golem's active, and even more armor while it's alive too. So whenever the Golem's going, you're actually a lot stronger. So a nice little perk there as we come up to the next board, which is Flesh Eater, a major damage increase since we're consuming corpses constantly. We enter the board from the bottom and work our way straight to the Glyph, where we have, of course, Territorial for the improved damage to close enemies and the damage reduction against them too. I activate it like so, picking up all the dexterity around it that I can afford to get. Then we work our way up and around to the right to come to the Legendary node and get Flesh Eater, and then leave the board to the right to cost effectively get to our last board, which is of course Scent of Death, a great damage reduction option. We enter the board on the left and come down and around through the Preservation node to get to the Glyph socket, where we of course have Essence for the big critical strike damage increase and critical strike damage improvement to those that are not healthy, which as we're not one-shotting everything and we're dealing damage over time, we get that effect on enemies constantly. So this is a major damage increase too. It requires 25 dex to get active, and I've been able to get 34 around this node, and then we finish this all off by coming up to the Legendary node, Scent of Death, and getting that active. And that's the Paragon board. This then brings us now to the gear section where we're just going to jump in. Featuring a lot of uniques, we start with the helmet, Godslayer Crown. When you stun, freeze or immobilize an elite enemy or damage a boss, it'll pull in nearby enemies, greatly improving your damage to them for 3 seconds, but that can only trigger every 12 seconds. This is a great way to improve our single target DPS, which is lacking in the build, but if you need more defenses in the build for any reason, then you can run Disobedience in this slot. On the chest piece, of course, our main defensive is Shielding Storm. On the gloves, we have Ultimate Shadow to turn the Bone Storm into a darkness skill to trigger shadow damage over time. On the legs, we have Tubalt's Will. Whenever we become unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, we get a major damage increase. So basically when we Blood Mist, we become unstoppable, we get the damage bonus. That happens a lot. On the boots, of course, it's Flicker Step, which is allowing us to reduce the cooldown of our ultimate up to 10 seconds at a time. On our wand, which you want to use for the lucky hit chance, we have Grasping Veins for the big critical strike chance improvement, and then the critical strike damage to those hit by the corpse tendrils. The offhand is of course the shield, Lidless Wall, to spread the bone storms in packs of enemies, and the amulet is Blighted Steel to greatly improve the damage we get after the Shadowblight key passive damages enemies 10 times. With all the ways we're spreading shadow damage, this happens constantly during mob clear. Our first ring is of course X-Fouls. As we're spreading damage over time constantly, we have a lucky hit chance to proc this explosion of damage, which happens very often. It's awesome. And then of course the Sacrilegious Soul, the new ring, which causes a corpse explosion to trigger up to every 1 second and a corpse tendril to trigger for free up to every 8 seconds on a top roll. This is incredible, and the affixes on it are also amazing, including the corpse skill levels. Speaking of affixes then, the stats on your gear are really important. You're going to want as much lucky hit chance as you can get, just like a true Infinimist build. This will help reset your Blood Mist and Bone Storm even more on your helmet, on your gloves, on your amulet, your rings. You can also get it on a wand, so there's lots of ways to get it and you want as much as possible. On your amulet, you'd also ideally have levels of the Gloom passive, since that's your major damage increase in the skill tree, and then you're going to be looking for cooldown reduction on items in general too to further help get these CDRs going. Outside of that, you can look for crit strike chance and crit strike damage and vulnerable damage as other damage improvers, and shadow damage over time if you can find that too. For defensive affixes, you're looking for the classic stuff of total armor, max life and damage reduction, and then damage reduction from close and far enemies works too. In this build, you can also get the damage reduction for those affected by shadow damage over time as another option. Lastly, for gems, it's pretty simple. We go for max life gems in our armor and shield in this case. On our weapon, we have the improvement to damage over time, and then in the jewelry, it's up to you. What are you currently lacking in your element resistances? I've managed to reach 70% in everything but fire resistance by running the cold resistance, the poison resistance, and the lightning resistance plus 30%. So you need to check your resistances, see what's lacking, and use these 3 slots to kind of boost it, or all of them. Jumping into the gameplay guide then. The build works much the same as Infinimist, only with some new gameplay mechanics to use. We start as always by decrepifying everything. It's a massive damage reduction and slow, but also a big damage increaser to those affected by it, and it gets our cooldown resetting based on lucky hit going, so it's very important. Outside of that, you Bone Storm on cooldown as soon as you enter a fight, and then Blood Mist straight into the pack to generate corpses, pop corpses in general, and spread your Bone Storm. The Golem will also get a Bone Storm as another damage source. And throughout that, you want to dash through grouped enemies ideally, usually the ones brought in by the auto-triggered corpse tendrils from your Sacrilegious ring. This will greatly reduce the cooldown of Bone Storm, and you want to be doing this so that your Bone Storm is next to always available. What's funny here though is, even when pushing tier 100s, the damage is so good that mobs die so often that I have little enemies to dash through at the end after a corpse tendril pull-in. It all just dies straight away. So just dash through enemies whenever possible and reapply Bone Storm as soon as possible after it ends. If you need to, you can manually corpse tendril, and to keep burst high, corpse explosion spam whenever you can, especially in single target when the enemy's sort of standing in piles and piles of it. You can also use the Bone Golem to taunt. It'll distract enemies while your Blood Mist and Bone Storm are on cooldown as an ideal time to use that. The downside of Golem is it kind of just dies at this level of gameplay. There's nothing we can do. It's just a constant issue when you're pushing tier 100s with any minion build of any kind. They've done a lot to improve this season with their numbers, but I think they still fail to give them enough damage reduction into the kit inherently. We have to sacrifice too much damage to actually use minion damage reduction aspects. Personally, I want those aspects gone. I want them put in the skill tree or something. So maybe in season 3, we'll finally see that right. But there you have it. That's our Storm of Bone Storms build. For speed clearing and tier 100 pushing, and also of course open world, I think this is extremely effective. It's just clearly the worst single target DPS compared to a true Infinimist build. However, I think with the upcoming event featuring those new Bloodforge dungeons, said to be harder than tier 100s, this might be a great pick. It's more likely to be more survivable while also having amazing mob clear, which is what the Bloodforges are going to be all about. In conclusion, with the Golem though, I think it's a great source for extra Bone Storm, a good distraction, and a source of lots of corpses. But I think you could run the same build without the Golem. That would free up a Paragon board in the sacrifice slot and even free points in the skill tree. The thing is, I just kind of wanted to use the Golem. It provides a lot of mob clear. It'd just be better if it would survive more in that hard endgame content. Truly, it just feels like they haven't balanced it for that. I could sacrifice a lot of my damage to make the Golem survive, but that's not worth it. Either way though, I'm still clearing tier 100 level content fast and easy. And overall, it's a fun, effective build for tier 100s and mob clear in general, and I think it's got a lot of potential when the Bloodforges roll around in December. But for now though, I've been Hollow, you've been you, thanks for watching, we'll see you next time.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.